So you decided to have a little play about, did you?
With who?
Oh, I don't know, some silly old tart. But whoever she is, Peggy, she's got a lot to answer for.
On tonight's programme, a mystery illness. What stopped doctors finding the cause? A parent's worst nightmare as a baby is feared dead, and the wreck of the Mohegan 100 years after it sunk. Hello and welcome to Mysteries. Our first film is an extraordinary story about a 2-year-old toddler called Hayes Burton. The Burton family always looked forward to their annual holiday down by the beach in Destin, Florida. But in 1993 they took a vacation that none of them would ever forget.
I've been vacationing in Destin since I was about 13 years old, and it's one of my very favorite places in the entire world.
Val Marie and her 3 children, Drew, Hayes and Anne Claire, were staying in a holiday apartment by the beach.
Your mind, sweetie.
Mom, can we go to the beach tomorrow?
First thing tomorrow, we're going to the beach.
Yes.
We had driven 8.5 hours and arrived probably 7:30 at night. I was very exhausted and asked them to allow me to get some rest the next morning, and then we'd hit the beach later in the day. I felt very safe in this room. I saw nothing that made me feel unsafe at all. Absolutely never in my wildest dreams did I imagine what was about to happen to my family.
Hi, Claire.
Next morning, Drew was the first up. While the rest of the family slept, he sneaked out to the beach. Later that morning, Anne Claire and Hayes woke up and found the front door still open.
The child was just out on the cart, just playing, and I assumed that, you know, they just checked in and assumed that someone was watching it. I was getting ready to check out of my room, so I just went on about my business, and unfortunately, I should have gone and got him.
We all fall down.
I walked down to put some stuff in my van when I spotted him. There was no doubt in my mind that it was the boy that I'd just seen minutes before.
God, someone call 911.
My brother-in-law came down, and I told him to get back to the 7th floor and start knocking on doors and find me someone that had a baby missing.
Hello? Anyone home? Hello?
I was in a dead sleep when I was awakened, so I jumped to go to the door. I was groggy.
Do you have a little baby here?
Yes.
You better get down. There's been an accident downstairs.
Oh, my God.
He and I ran out and looked down over the balcony. At that point in time, I knew in my mind that child was dead, that my son was dead. There was no way he had survived. That from 8 stories up, looking down, he was a small speck on a piece of black asphalt.
I knew the boy had fallen at least 80 to 85 feet. I could see there was little trickle of blood coming out of his mouth, and he looked pretty lifeless to me.
Baby! Are you okay?
It was like being in a dream, denial that this was really even happening, and knowing in your gut he must be dead.
The emergency services had been told that Hayes had fallen 8 stories. They arrived expecting the worst.
I've dealt with an awful lot of medical emergencies and rescue emergencies. We've never had anyone survive on any type of fall over 4 stories.
So Peter was surprised by what he found.
Once we got there and started to do our patient assessment and we got next to him, we really didn't have anything we could report other than some minor bruising and very superficial wounds that we could see at that time.
So get him boarded and get a...
We were a little stunned by that, but we switched gears and went into a normal rescue mode where we could do an extensive patient assessment and get him transported quickly.
I felt for sure he was brain dead. I felt for sure his internal organs were completely like jello.
Hayes was alive, but no one knew how badly he'd been injured. He was rushed to hospital where Dr. Louisville was on duty.
Even if it was just 1-2 stories, you expect severe injuries. I expected the child to have some major fractures, possibly a head injury, and possibly some internal injuries.
I didn't feel like the news would be good. Even if he had survived, he must have horrible injuries that would, could be possibly brain dead, or we could be facing a situation of organ donation. And there were lots of conflicting thoughts running through my mind.
He was screaming when he came in, and that was actually reassuring to hear him. Because that meant that there was not any significant respiratory injuries.
I began to pray, earnestly. I had prayed for guardian angels for my children for many years. I was totally out of control, so it was in God's hands.
Dr. Louisville expected tests to show massive internal injuries.
Some x-rays, x-rays of his neck, C-spine, long bone x-rays, and eventually got a CAT scan of his brain. Hello, Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
I'm Dr. Louisville.
The exact words I will never forget. He said, Mrs. Burton, I can find no medical rationale or reasoning, but I cannot find anything wrong with your son. And I was just completely overwhelmed and overjoyed and grabbed him physically and embraced him.
I felt disbelief that he had fell in 8 stories and survived, and I was amazed that he had not sustained any significant injuries as a result of the fall.
5 years later, Hayes has no ill effects from the fall.
Hayes is a 7-year-old normal boy that loves outside and frogs and dirt and tractors, and he loves just about everything there is to love about life.
So how can Hayes' survival be explained?
Small children's skeleton is extremely pliable and flexible. They sort of bounce like balls when they fall.
Baby? Sweetheart? Are you okay?
There is no other explanation but divine intervention in a situation like this. God chose to spare his life, and he did, and that's it. There's nothing else to say.
Not everyone is so convinced.
If there's a miraculous component in this whole thing, maybe the fact that the baby fell on his butt. That's the only thing that could have saved him, I think. When the baby hit the ground, he had to be going in the neighborhood of 50 miles an hour. I believe what happened was that the baby fell on the diaper. So when the baby falls on this diaper, there's air trapped in there. It acts like a balloon and expands, and then that explains the fact that the diaper was exploded. And the diaper absorbed virtually all the force that was applied to the baby.
We don't ever know why things happen the way they do, but there's reasons. I believe everything happens for a reason.
In bad weather, the Falmouth coastline in Cornwall is one of the most dangerous in Britain. More than 1,000 ships have sunk there, costing hundreds of lives. But in good weather, those same waters become a mecca for divers searching for wrecks. And there's one in particular which has a special reputation. The Mohegan, which sank 100 years ago, almost to this day.
Roger Buxton is no stranger to the Cornish coastline, as skipper of his boat, the Gammy Lady.
I've been taking divers for 10 years. I've got a fair bit of local knowledge. I know where the wrecks are. It's a very responsible job, as the sea can be a very dangerous place, especially around the manacles.
G'day, nice to see you again.
I've always dived with Roger because he's friendly, knowledgeable and hugely reliable. And if you need someone to find a wreck, then he'll get you on the wreck. And one of the main attractions of the area, if not the best attraction in the area, is the wreck of the Mohegan, which lies by the Manacles Rocks, and at the deepest part is at 28 metres.
The Mohegan can only be dived at slack water. This is at the time when the tides go still. At any other time, diving is very dangerous.
To get to dive the Mohegan, Roger needs to bring the boat in quite close to the Manacles. He then needs to locate the wreck using both, obviously, his experience and his echo sounders. Once that's accomplished, then the divers will enter the water on Roger's signal and go down to the wreck.
Looks like we've got a slack. We should have a good dive.
On this occasion, we were diving off of the Gammy Lady, and I was taking down a young girl who'd never dived a deep dive in England before.
Clear behind.
On the way down to the Mohegan, going down the shot line, you don't see a great deal. It's very dark, which increases the sense of adventure. And what you're waiting for is for the wreck to appear out of the gloom. The boilers of the Mohegan appeared out of the gloom, encrusted with a coral formation known as dead men's fingers, which is an extraordinary sight to see, because they do resemble dead men's hands. And I was fascinated by this and didn't want to stop looking. Once you come onto the boilers, you can swim through them, and then you come onto the rest of the wreck, where there is a great deal of general wreckage, kind of leftover detritus of the wreck. And you get the sense then, really, that here you are intruding. Obviously, people lived on this ship and were killed on the ship, and you do get a profound sense of loss when you see the wreckage spread out over the ocean floor like that. As we swam round and explored the wreck, my initial preoccupation with the girl and her safety and her enjoyment of the dive gave way to a greater sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. And it was then that it happened. I heard a noise which you could only equate with whistling. At first I ignored the noise because you do hear a great many noises underwater, but the second time I heard it, then, I had to think again. It was a low, moaning noise, although it was unlike any whistle I'd heard before. The third time I heard the noise just re-emphasised how uneasy I was feeling at the time. And it was really then that I made the decision to end the dive and get out of the water. To this day, I don't know what the sound signified or what it was or what it meant or where it came from. Only that it came from the wreck of the Mohegan and made me feel profoundly uneasy about diving the wreck again.
When Howard came back to the boat, I knew there was something not quite right with him. And he didn't say anything for a while, and then he came to me, told me of his experience. Of course, at the time, I didn't take a great deal of notice, but sometime later, when I had another experienced diver on, and he had a very similar experience, that is when I started taking it on board and taking notice of what people were saying.
Ken Baisley had been diving in this area for over 15 years.
I'm quite used to tales of wrecks and wreckers and sea monsters and strange happenings. But what happened to me on that particular dive was most weird and strange and quite disturbing. I'd always heard an awful lot about the Mohegan. It had a lot of history locked up in it, and I really wanted to dive it and find it for the first time. On the way down, it was a little bit murky, and we were all excited at the prospect that we were going to find the Mohegan. And the wreckage itself is like a pack of cards that's compressed or dropped down, and the wreckage is all still there, and there are areas where you can actually, with great care, enter. And you see quite a lot of artifacts on the bottom. The whole wreck is as if it were time-locked, as if it were or had just sunk the day before. You don't see a ship, you see wreckage, but everything is there as it was the day that it actually sank. Right below, I recognised something that wasn't natural, that was more man-made, and I decided to descend a little bit further and to investigate. It appeared to be a bollard, the thing that ships are tied up with when they come alongside the quay. I got right up to it, and then I reached out my hand to touch it. And honestly, what happened next literally took my breath away. It's hard to explain, really. It was like receiving an electric shock. You felt that you'd actually made contact with something else. The jolt certainly surprised me, shocked me, and it's something that you don't expect to get underwater. I mean, you just don't. You go on a wreck dive, you touch the wreck, and this happens. Very, very strange. I felt that I wanted to get out of there just at that particular time. I wasn't happy to stay in the area, and so we made a fairly rapid descent and exited the water.
When Ken returned to the boat, he was quite shaken, and I'll be honest with you, I hadn't seen anybody shaken like that before.
Since then, several divers have claimed to have had strange experiences while diving on the Mohegan. A local historian believes he may know why.
One of the reasons I'm sure that divers experience this somewhat unique atmosphere is because of the history of the Mohegan. The fact that 106 people lost their lives in the disaster, many bodies were not actually recovered, and I'm sure this colours their thinking when they're diving on the Mohegan.
I'm not a fanciful man. I've dived the area for many, many years. I've been a fireman in the local Coast Guard, so I don't make up stories. So I would respect their sort of opinion, but at the same time, I know exactly what happened on that dive.
So what else would explain what happened to Ken?
It sounds to me that Ken's experience could be a possible narcosis. We tend to soak up the nitrogen from the air we breathe, and divers, of course, breathe compressed air, and 80% of the air we breathe is nitrogen. Nitrogen narcosis is something which happens when a diver is under pressure, and it can happen at any depth. It affects different people in different ways. Most people suffer paranoia. They suffer fear, and this can lead to hallucinatory effects.
It's always probably a good way of explaining it, but I've dived very deep, much deeper than the 15 metres that I was diving on that particular day. And I can honestly say that I don't experience nitrogen narcosis at that depth. It would have to be much, much deeper.
But how can Howard's experiences be explained?
Howard was probably suffering the effects of distorted hearing underwater. Sound travels much faster underwater. Sounds that come from a long way off suddenly appear to be right almost next to our heads. And of course, this sensory deprivation, which is the effect of poor hearing and poor vision, can make the sounds of our own body seem to be more important than they would otherwise be. Our own heartbeat, our own breathing, air moving about inside our own equipment, of course, can make a whistling noise.
I've been diving for 3 years, and I've been an instructor since September of last year. You hear a lot of strange things underwater. You hear a lot of strange noises. This is a noise I haven't ever been able to ascribe to any particular thing. I can never explain it to anyone, to myself. If people say to me, you didn't hear it, then all I can say is, well, I did, you know. And no one's been able to give me a decent explanation as to what it was.
After the dive, I spoke with some friends who suggested that I should take some flowers back to the site and place them on the wreck as a mark of respect. And that's exactly what I did. And having put the flowers on the wreck, I haven't had any other strange experiences on the site.
The first death in the U.S. was reported in the mid-70s, but it was several more years before a pattern emerged. And today, we still don't know what killed them.
Over the last 21 years, there have been 140 unexplained deaths across the United States, where all that's known for certain is that all the victims were male, all of them from Southeast Asia, and they all died suddenly in their sleep.
There was nothing different about that night. It was just like any other. When he got home, I asked if I could cook him something. He said he wasn't hungry. He drank a glass of water and then went to bed. When I went to bed, he was already asleep, snoring. I tried to wake him to stop him snoring. The next minute, he seemed to stop breathing. I called an ambulance. When the paramedic arrived, they tried to resuscitate him. But I knew it was already too late. His heart had stopped beating. He was already dead.
News of similar deaths quickly traveled through the Asian community.
One death here in Minnesota can be heard on the East Coast, overnight. It's something that travels very rapidly, and it certainly creates a lot of fear in the community, especially for the men in those age groups, it's 25 to late 40s.
The government was frightened there might be an unknown epidemic. They called in the Center for Disease Control.
We were working a bit like medical detectives. All these people were dying, no one knew why they died, and we wanted to find out the common feature amongst all of them.
Dr. Kirshner found that although sleep death was new to America, it had already been documented in Asia.
I knew that this disorder was nothing new, that it had been reported back in the Philippines in medical literature in 1950, and it was well known in the folklore of several Southeast Asian countries.
The first breakthrough in the investigation came when Dr. Kirshner discovered almost all the victims had come from the same tribe. They were called the Hmong and came from the border of Laos and Thailand.
And one of the theories was that the shock of moving from Laos to the United States, the cultural shock and the environmental shock, was responsible for these deaths.
Hmong, as you know, came from a very agricultural background, the mountains from the countryside, and now they're coming into very industrialized cities and towns, very, very busy, fast-paced. The death may be stress-related, and the stress is brought upon by the cultural changes that these people have undergone.
At first, this seemed to be a plausible explanation, but as the investigation continued, doubts were raised.
The problem with the culture shock argument is that some of the victims were newly arrived in this country, but others had lived here for many years. Also, the fact that only men were involved and not women is something else that is against the culture shock argument.
Although autopsies had been carried out, he was worried something linked to the victims' hearts might have been missed.
We felt that we had certain tools to use in terms of our examination of the hearts that others had not used. And we hoped that that would help us to gain some understanding of this disorder and what was causing these deaths.
So the hearts of the next 40 victims were rushed to Dr. Kirshner's lab for analysis.
We felt the underlying common denominator had to be some form of cardiac arrhythmia, that is abnormal heartbeat or abnormal rhythm in the heart that would lead to these deaths.
Although Dr. Kirshner was able to prove that all the men had died from sudden heart attacks, he still couldn't discover the actual cause. But what he hadn't bargained for was the reaction to his experiments from the Hmong community.
We believe in reincarnation. If you take the heart, you take the spirit, which means the spirit cannot pass into the next life.
With no new leads, Dr. Kirshner was forced to look again at what he knew for certain.
All these men died during their sleep, and that some of them appear to wake up momentarily and cry out and then die, as though they were awakening from a nightmare.
So could these men's dreams be literally killing them?
In many cultures, the term scared to death has some basis in reality. Dream sleep is a time of instability of many vital body functions. The combination of the fear of the dream coupled with the instability of the heart rate and rhythm and breathing rate and rhythm in combination are enough to cause death.
But once again, close analysis seemed to suggest otherwise.
I don't go along with the night terror argument because, in fact, most of these men died peacefully in their sleep and were only found dead in the morning. So it's only a small number that actually appeared to have had some type of nightmare before they died.
But there are experts who believe the causes of these deaths may have started before the Hmong even arrived in America.
During the Vietnam War, the communists had dropped nerve gases and other poisonous chemicals on northern Laos in retaliation for the assistance that the Hmong tribe had provided U.S. soldiers. The Hmong refer to these chemicals as yellow rain. And the Hmong thought that perhaps these chemicals and gases had some type of delayed reaction that may have triggered the sleeping deaths.
I don't buy the yellow rain argument. Many of the victims had not been exposed to yellow rain. They had come to this country before it was reported. Also, again, why only in men? Why in their sleep?
21 years after the first death, experts are no closer to finding the answer.
I have to confess that even after all of our work, we're still puzzled by the underlying cause of this disorder.
That's all for this week. On our next program,
Get off me!
where did this man find his amazing strength? The Spanish village terrified by faces appearing in a floor.
Hillary, come back! Hillary! Hillary!
And what pulled this girl from the clutches of death?
I felt so helpless because I couldn't do anything.
And that next programme is at 8:30 next Tuesday night. Next tonight on BBC One, Del Boy warms up his persuasive powers in Only Fools and Horses.